Hello and welcome to the Legislative Report. I'm State Representative Keith Gillespie of the 47th District in York County. One of the biggest and most important challenges facing the state legislature each year is the adoption of a budget. Governor Corbett has proposed a budget that holds the line on spending. It's now the legislature's job to craft a spending plan for the next fiscal year. Joining me now to discuss this year's budget is Majority Appropriations Chairman Bill Adolph. Representative Adolph, thanks for being here.
Nice to be here, Keith.
Now you're from the southeastern part of the state, Delaware County, I believe.
Delaware County, yes.
Yeah, I've had an opportunity to, when you were chair of the Professional Licensure Committee, to have some hearings down here. It's a beautiful part of the state.
Yes, it is.
And this is your second or third time as Appropriations Chairman.
This is my third year as a Republican Appropriations Chair. I served 1 year as the Minority Appropriations Chair. This is my second year as the Majority Chair.
Great. I know you had one term or one episode during the previous administration, and then of course last year, for the first time in 8 years, we were able to get the budget done on time, and I know you were a big part of that process.
Well, Keith, people would like to downplay that particular process of getting it done on time, and even though we were like 13 minutes before the midnight hour, and there's been some jokes about that. But I quickly respond by that. State agencies throughout the Commonwealth, county governments, educational institutions, they all need to know what the revenue is going to be at the state level. And during the previous administration, that never got done. And unfortunately, 1 year as late as December, almost 6 full months late. And colleges and counties and nonprofits, they were out borrowing money in order to pay their bills. And people forget that. And I like to remind people that when they think on-time budgets is kind of a ridiculous political aspect of the game. But believe me, as a businessman, on-time budgets mean something.
Yeah, a great point. And I think we need to probably talk about the process a little bit more, but those certainly were some dark days. I mean, I was here with you during those previous 8 years, and nobody enjoyed that process. It was extremely just a nasty situation, people being used as hostages and pawns in a very nasty game, and it really didn't need to be done, and it was great last year to be able to see it go through the way that it was supposed to go through.
Yeah, I really believe that we're still paying for those days in many ways. If folks would understand that during those 8 years, that the cost of living, the consumer price index, was 19%. And I'm talking about from the year 2002 to the year 2010. The consumer price index was 19%. Pennsylvania state government spent at a rate of 33%. That's phenomenal. The previous administration used $7 billion. Now, sometimes people can't believe that. $7 billion, that's billion with a B, of federal stimulus money for out-of-control spending. And now we have a very difficult, very difficult problem of controlling spending and, quite frankly, explain to people how we got here. And we're not mean people. We're just trying to live within our means. And it's difficult because, Keith, it's a lot easier to say yes to people than it is no to people. And you have to do that in all walks of life. Family budgets, small business, have to live within the budgets. If you lose a client, you have to cut down on your expenses. It's that simple. You lose some customers, competition comes down the street, you have to control your spending. We were on a crash course for disaster. And a lot of folks don't understand that. And fortunately, we're now starting to control this, and we're still in the worst recession that this country has ever faced. And we're not out of the woods yet. So we have to be very, very careful on how we spend our very precious state tax dollars.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, and I think it's certainly very appropriate, about families and what they're doing at home. And you know, they can only spend what they have. They can't go down to the basement and print it and come up with all these other creative ways to get revenue in. They're simply living within their means, and simply something that the Commonwealth needs to do now that it didn't necessarily do previously. Okay, so a little bit more about your background. You are a CPA, and actually you have a practice, I guess, aside from the legislature.
Yeah, you know, my partner runs the everyday aspect of the firm.
Clearly, with your time commitments
No,
here, you can't do that.
I do no public accounting work at all anymore. I still prepare some individual tax returns on the weekends and enjoy doing that. And it really, quite frankly, it really keeps you in touch with the financial aspect and the tax structure of our Commonwealth and our federal government. Because if you look at the front page of the 1040 and the back page of the 1040, they're all the subjects that you're talking about: energy, child care, education credits. The 1040 is really what's talking about on the front pages of every newspaper in the country. So, but the difference being is that I'm talking to those individuals and listening to what their trials and tribulations are on everyday experiences.
Okay, and then clearly with your seat at the budget negotiations table and the hearings that you were recently conducted, having that background is extremely important and critical, and we're fortunate to have that expertise. So we are talking a little bit about the budget process. I know Governor Corbett several weeks ago met his constitutional obligation by presenting at least the outline of a balanced budget for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. From that, we've all done some analyzation, and then most recently you conducted several weeks worth of appropriations hearings. And maybe you could just give us an overview of what that process has been like since Governor presented his address.
The governor on February 7th addressed a joint session of the House and the Senate, and presented to the legislature and to the taxpayers of Pennsylvania a blueprint of what his budget secretary feels is what type of revenue the state's going to bring in, and what the mandatory obligations are to spend. And after those mandatory obligations, then outlined his plan on some various different line items. Both the Senate Appropriations Committee and the House Appropriations Committee, the week after, hold 3 weeks worth of budget hearings. And ours was held in the House Majority Caucus Room, which I know you're very familiar with. And we go and invite every member of the cabinet, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Welfare, Secretary of Education, and they come in with their staff and they go through their budget. Very similar to what county governments do, very similar to what municipalities do, school districts do, and open to the public, aired on PCN, and in most cases, a packed house with advocates, pro and con, on those issues. And very, very interesting. Most of the hearings ran longer than what we had scheduled, and our hearings would start, roughly at 9 o'clock in the morning. The Republicans, we would come in here at 8, and we would be briefed on the issues by our staff. And from 9 o'clock on to most days was about 6 o'clock, with very few breaks in between. We heard from the Major General of the State Police to the Pennsylvania Horsemen's Association, and what their requests were, how they were managing their budgets under our current fiscal year, and whether they needed more or less money for next year. So it's a long, tedious process, but one that I feel is very, very important. And learned an awful lot. Every day I learned something. Every hearing I learned something. Sometimes it got a little heated, okay, because there's a lot of passion out there on both sides of the aisle on some of these funding sources. And but I think we tried to keep everybody cool, calm, and collective, and got to the bottom line.
Great. I know a lot of those individuals probably wear multiple hats, meaning they're in charge of a lot of different departments and entities. You have a feel for how many folks testified over the previous 3 weeks?
Well, I would say on an average of about 5 hearings a day, times 4 for 4 days a week. So that's 20, times 3. I'm going to say, you know, we had quite a few testifiers.
Exactly. And you mentioned about mandatory obligations that the governor and that we have to meet as part of the budget. What are some of those mandatory obligations? Obviously, education and you know, some of the
well, some of the line items that a lot of folks don't think of right away is our debt. Okay, our debt service, just like at home, no different than at home. The first bills you have to pay every month, you know, is what is your debt, you know. And Pennsylvania has a debt obligation, and that's mandated. We got to take care of that. And you know, we're not in real bad shape as compared to most states, but we're a AA rating, and we want to keep it that way. So that's very important. Pension obligations. I think this administration is taking that very serious. You know, I know for a fact that the previous administration played the shell game and did not always pay the pension obligation that they should have. And as a result of that, makes it much more difficult today. And that wasn't the first administration to do that either, Keith. It went on for 2 previous administrations. I think we had a little bit of a problem there in moving around and not paying our obligations. But the difference between the 2 previous administrations, we were in a great economy, and interest rates were booming. And so it made more sense to, hey, let the earnings pay for the obligation instead of writing a check. And so they were still getting that same amount, but we were not writing a check. What happened during the last administration, we weren't paying enough based upon the unfunded liability. And during those 8 years, our unfunded liability really went out of control. So this administration is getting serious about our pension obligation. And then we got corrections. You know, if we're going to put people in jail, we have to have a facility. And unfortunately in Pennsylvania and in a lot of other states, because of the mandatory minimum prison sentences, our prisons became overcrowded, and we were obligated to build some new state prisons, very costly. So then, of course, public education, K to 12, is 36% of our state budget, and an awful lot of folks feel that this is one of the most important line items in our state budget.
Well, it's certainly something you and I hear quite frequently from our constituents concerning education. And we're going to take a break here, and we'll come back and we'll pick up with the funding for education.
Very good.
Let's take a short break. Legislative report will return in a moment.
Did you know that Fort Indiantown Gap, located in Lebanon County, is home to Pennsylvania's only Veterans Memorial? C.J. Frederick of Westchester, Bucks County, submitted the winning design that now honors those men and women who have sacrificed their lives in defending this great country. Dedicated to the Commonwealth on October 7, 2001, the Veterans Memorial is surrounded by freestanding walls and houses an amphitheater, which can accommodate large crowds during an event. Strategically placed in the front of the amphitheater is a tomb that reminds visitors of those who gave their lives protecting the freedoms of this nation. The design suggests a war-damaged structure in which Frederick wanted to impress upon those visiting the horrific arena of war. Now you know.
Did you know that in the corridors in the first floor of the capital of Pennsylvania, there are nearly 400 individual mosaics? The idea for creating these intricate tiles was first suggested by Henry C. Mercer in 1902. A year later, he received the commission to prove 16,000 square feet of pavement tiles for the Great Rotunda and corridors of the new state capitol building in Harrisburg. Mercer set about designing subjects for approximately 400 mosaics. He chose as his general theme the history of Pennsylvania, and he soon realized that his tiles could tell stories. Although the arrangement seems random, the mosaics are very thoughtfully placed in the floor. The tile sequence is roughly chronological, beginning at one end with the scenes depicting the Native Americans. The mosaics progress into the story of European habitation in the New World and encompass the Commonwealth's triumph through process and intervention. Now you know.
Welcome back to the program. I'm State Representative Keith Gillespie. I'm pleased to have Representative Bill Adolph as my guest. Representative Adolph is the chair of the Appropriations Committee, and we're discussing the state budget. Representative Adolph, great to once again to have you here, and I appreciate you taking the time to educate us on the 2012-2013 state budget and the process and all the ramifications associated with it. Now, prior to taking a break, we were talking about one of the biggies, which is education funding, and I think you said that's like 36% of the budget.
36%, Keith, over $9 billion a year that the state appropriates for public education, K to 12.
Okay. And I think we might have a chart here. It says, and I believe you also said that the Department of Welfare budget has actually surpassed education at 39%.
Yeah, the public welfare budget is now 39% of our state budget, representing $10.5 billion a year. Now, this particular line item is the fastest growing line item in the state budget, probably nationwide. The Medicare reimbursements just off the charts, and of course the state's paying for that. And I think we are very, very fortunate here in the state to have a man of Secretary Alexander's knowledge of the issue, and he really is starting to put controls in. You know, last year it was well known that our Department of Welfare had a crazy little saying, close your eyes and authorize. And that budget was, as proposed, almost $1 billion more, because there was $1 billion worth of stimulus money involved in that welfare budget. We had lost that. So we really could not continue with that type of, phraseology. And this guy really did a great job, and he has it under control. But you could tell that in his testimony to us during the budget hearings, that he really sees a lot of problems, and still unsustainable unsustainable type spending. And he was criticized terribly for putting a hold on applications until they were thoroughly investigated. Instead of just approving them or authorizing them, he put everything on hold. Now, it turned out that 25% of this particular category, those applicants became ineligible, even after all the investigation. I think that's a pretty big number, 25%. And but 75% finally became eligible and are back on the rolls. But this is a nationwide problem, Keith. This is a nationwide problem. We're eliminating the cash assistance programs, just eliminating them. It's not mandatory. It's something that has grown out of control. There's very little accountability in those cash assistance line items. And what we want to emphasize here, Keith, is that there's $10.5 billion that we're spending in taxes. We want to make sure that it gets to the folks that need it the most. Those Pennsylvania residents in wheelchairs, the elderly, the mentally challenged, those individuals with those type of disabilities, we have an obligation to help those have some type of lifestyle. But the fraud and abuse that existed in this department was rapid. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult because when you talk about welfare cuts, you know, you're talking about some of the folks that need it the most. Well, we're trying to make sure that the tax dollars get to those folks. And we now have to take a look at how this money is being distributed, okay? Last year, the department made sure that those that were eligible were getting the money. Now we got to make sure that those are eligible are getting the money, you know, from the top. And it's easier said than done because I've worked with the Internal Revenue Service code for 30 years. It's nothing compared to this welfare code. This welfare code just is so complicated. There's so many regulations that these providers have to follow. No wonder spending's out of control. So this is an area that you know, we need to control, and we're going to have to.
You know, you mentioned fraud and abuse, and I'm just really curious as to how maybe we can get our hands around that. Auditor General Jack Wagner came out and just with a guesstimate of a study that he had done, and I remember I'm sure you saw it as well, between $750 million and $1 billion of projected fraud. I'm sure you get the same phone calls and emails and visits that I get from people who are at maybe like one of the big box stores or even a local supermarket, and we'll see individuals come through and maybe buying $800 worth of soda. Now, nobody drinks $800 worth of soda, even, you know, maybe at the end of tax season you celebrate with that much soda, but it's obvious they're taking it out in the parking lot, probably selling it for cash and then going downtown and you know, buying illicit drugs or alcohol with it with tax dollars. And that's fraud and abuse. And I mean, how do we get our hands around those individuals that are just abusing the system? And as you mentioned, those people that are in a wheelchair or in a really tough situation are not getting the resources that they need.
Well, you know, I think you explained it perfectly. You know, we hear about the two extremes. Those that are committing the fraud and abusing the system, and those eligible individuals that didn't receive them enough money, okay? And we're left out in the cold, so to speak. Okay, somewhere in between, we have to bring all this in and try to better supervise the distribution of these state tax dollars. Now, what the Secretary of Welfare and the Governor is talking about is a block grant. And the state is going to send to the counties, the individual counties, X amount of dollars. And it won't have the stipulations, the red tape, the bureaucracy attached to it like it had in previous years. And there was times where you could only spend X amount of dollars in a certain category, and you'd have to lapse that money. Well, now whatever you get, you can spend wherever that county official, wherever that administrator feels is necessary to spend. Now, those block grants were decreased compared to the other grants, the 7 categorical grants that were sent there. We think it's a good way to modify and make sure that they are better able to distribute the money. Not quite sure if that's the right dollar amount, but we're going to be working with our county commissioners to find out.
Well, certainly in these challenging times, and as you mentioned, the greatest recession that you and I have ever seen in our lifetimes, I think we have to think outside of the box and try something new and innovative, and this is certainly a great opportunity. Representative Adolph, unfortunately, we're just about out of time here, and I know we just briefly touched on education. Perhaps we can get together again and maybe focus on that and some of the opponents. But I really do appreciate you availing yourself to the citizens of the 47th here this morning and giving us a brief overview of the state budget.
My pleasure.
That's all the time we have for today's program. If you have comments or questions about these or any other legislative topics, my contact information will be on the screen in a moment. Thanks for watching, and join me again for Legislative Report.